the US packed up and left. And not only did they leave, Pakistan was slapped with Pressler sanctions. So Pakistan then was left with 4 million Afghan refugees, a number of militant groups which had been created to fight the Soviets, all dressed up and nowhere to go. We had heroin, drugs that were used to, at some point, to pay for the fighting in Afghanistan. So Pakistan, then first time we had these sectarian attacks and sectarian militant groups, which were first time we heard of sectarian attacks inside Pakistan. Then comes 9/11, and Pakistan again joins the US. I was then, I only had one seat in parliament at the time, and I remember when General Musharraf was consulting all of us that the US wants us to join them in the war. I opposed it. I thought Pakistan should stay neutral. And I'll tell you why I thought Pakistan should stay neutral. We had created these jihadi groups in the 80s. We had indoctrinated them in the idea of jihad, that foreign occupation in Afghanistan, it was a religious duty to fight them. So all these groups, including Al-Qaeda, had arrived in Pakistan. Now comes 9/11, then the US invades Afghanistan. And now we are trying to tell these same groups who had close links with the Pakistan army, because they were created by the Pakistan army, now we are telling them that no, it's because the good guys are there, it's no longer jihad. Now obviously, a lot of them turned against the Pakistan army, because Pakistan army was then trying to neutralize them. So what we went through, and I just briefly mentioned earlier, it was the worst time in our history. These groups turned against the Pakistan army and the state of Pakistan. And not only that, there were linkages between, clearly there were linkages between these groups and the Pakistani security forces, because they had created them. So we had insider attacks, we had, the GHQ was attacked, generals were killed, ISI headquarters were attacked. The army, at one point, the army could not go into the cities in military clothes or with military cars. It was that bad at one point. And then, of course, the second thing was the tribal areas. We should never have sent army into the tribal areas, because the tribal area per capita was the most weaponized area in the world. For people who don't know, tribal area is the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It was always an autonomous area. The British never occupied it during their rule since 1890. So it was an autonomous area. It ran by its own rules. So in 2004, under pressure from the United States, Pakistan army went into the tribal areas to flush out Al-Qaeda. Now, what happened was that when, after Tora Bora in Afghanistan, a few of the Al-Qaeda moved into our tribal areas, which were semi-autonomous. So when they sent the army in, armies are not meant to go into civilian areas. Whenever you send your army into civilian areas, you can ensure that there will be human rights abuses, there will be collateral damage, there will be innocent people killed, because there's no army there. They're just guerrillas operating from villages. So, the collateral damage created what became the Pakistani Taliban. There was no Pakistani Taliban before. So we then had the people of tribal areas suffered. One point there were these militants, the other side was the Pakistan army. Half of the tribal area was then internally displaced. The damage, we still haven't, the amount of damage done in the tribal area, we still haven't got the resources to compensate them. So basically the country went through hell. In my opinion, we should have stayed neutral. That way we would have had control over these militant groups, and we could have in our own time neutralized them. But because we became a part of the US war, they turned against Pakistan. And so now what I feel, there was a watershed in Pakistan, in Pakistani politics. In 2014, the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, they slaughtered 150 school children in what was called the APS, the Army Public School. There was a reaction within Pakistan. All the political parties then signed a paper called the National Action Plan. And we all decided after that that we will not allow any militant groups to operate inside Pakistan. Until we came into power, the governments did not have the political will, because when you talk about the militant groups, they still have about 30 to 40,000 armed people who have been trained and in some sort of a theater, who fought either in Afghanistan, maybe in Kashmir. So we were the first government who has now started disarming all the militant groups. This is the first time it is happening. We have taken over their institutes, their seminaries. We've got administrators there. So it is the first time in Pakistan that we have decided there will be no armed militias inside our country.
Which relates to the next question I want to ask you, and it's been in the news a lot. It's clearly a significant element in U.S.-Pakistan relationships, and that's what you referred to as well, the ongoing Afghan peace process and the possibilities that we might actually have some breakthroughs. And building on what you just said, is the Pakistan government able and willing to make the commitments to really help move these dialogues forward, especially in the event that the Taliban and the Afghan government aren't able to get a meeting organized?
It's just for people's benefit. The fear amongst the Pakistan military establishment was always that there would be a two-front situation. So there would be, the Eastern Front, which is India. And then if Afghanistan was also in the Indian sphere of influence, then Pakistan would be sandwiched between these two. And so this was always the worry about the Pakistan military establishment, and which is why they wanted what was called the strategic depth. But this has changed. Today, there is no concept in Pakistan of strategic depth, because we feel that by interfering in Afghanistan, in order to secure the strategic depth, we have actually done a lot of damage to our own country. And for no rhyme or reason, we have become partisan in Afghanistan's internal affairs. Now, and I speak for Pakistan Army because, normally there was that, there's Pakistan Army is this independent entity, and, the governments have no control over it. I can sit here and tell you that as I speak, the Pakistan Army is exactly behind the government's program. Whatever our policies from day one we've arrived, peace with India, they were behind. When I decided to release the Indian pilot who had been shot down in Pakistan, the army was right behind me. So we today speak as, that there's no difference between the policies of the Pakistan security forces or the Pakistan's democratic government. And we believe that we should not ever interfere in the internal affairs of Afghanistan. Let the Afghans decide what they want, what sort of government they want, and we should facilitate the peace process. So this is the big difference now. Okay. We are all on the same page, and fortunately now that the United States is on the same page too, because, after, the Einstein's definition of madness, trying to do the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, 19 years of conflict. And if they had gone, thank God for President Trump, this could have gone on for another 19 years without any result.
But it sounds like you're willing to use your leverage with the Taliban to facilitate the peace process. You see, which is a big welcome change.
The Taliban delegation wanted to meet me a few months back, and when I became the prime minister. And it's because I always maintained that there was no military solution, while everyone else in Pakistan's political spectrum kept sort of agreeing that there was some military solution. So because of that, I had a certain amount of credibility amongst them. They wanted to meet me, but the Afghan government at that point did not want me to meet them. So I did not meet them, but now when I go back, after meeting President Trump, and also I've spoken to President Ghani, now I will meet the Taliban and I will try my best to get them to talk to the Afghan government, and so that the election in Afghanistan must be an inclusive election where the Taliban also participate in it.
Great, thanks. I want to ask something that's very important to people here, and that is the view that in Pakistan, censorship and harassment of the press, of activists and dissenting voices of women is on the rise. And you just spoke very eloquently about a new Pakistan, talked about the inequalities that have plagued the economy. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts and commitments about also protecting the pluralism and the freedom of speech and of the media that's so important to a democratic Pakistan?
Just let me say one thing. My government, and time will prove this, will be the most inclusive government in Pakistan ever. We will try, we have already now ensured full protection for our minorities. We have, I won't go into details, but there's one element where we still have a problem. But what we have done, no government has done before. And I'll give you an example that there was this case of Asia Bibi. She was this Christian woman who was jailed, and no judge would try them because of blasphemy. And because of the strength of one particular group, which had the previous government was held hostage by the group. They came in and they literally blocked the roads. And people were scared of that group. So when the judgment was given to free her by the Supreme Court, the same group then threatened. They came out on the streets. They were rioting for 2 days, and the stage was held hostage for 2 days. But this is the first government that, on the next opportune moment, actually took them out. We put them in jails. We just completely, and Asia Bibi was then safely, she came out, and then she wanted to leave the country, and we helped her. So all I'm saying is that this government you will see that it will treat its minorities as equal citizens. There's just one thing, I don't want to go into details, but there's one aspect, I can't talk about it, but we have still a problem. I'm not saying we've completely controlled the situation, but you will see that this is not out of worry about what the Western world or any other people say about us. It's because out of our conviction that our minorities, according to our religion, according to our constitution, are equal citizens. Now the media. I have, my life, I went to university in England, and I spent about 18 summers of my life in England. And I've seen the British media, very open, very free media. The Pakistan media, in my opinion, is even freer than the British media. There is the media in Pakistan, is not just free, but sometimes out of control. I can tell you that in Britain, no media would have published things like, or said on television things like the Pakistan media has done. I can tell you since I've been in power. Imagine, I don't even think in America this would be allowed, even though the media has this love-hate relationship with President Trump, more hate than love sometimes. But imagine that, a prime minister of a country, and this man sits on television and says that I can tell you that he's getting divorced tomorrow. So if there was some truth in it, you would, okay, if he had some knowledge. But there's only me and my wife living together. Where did he get this information from? But this sort of thing, I mean, in the olden days, I can tell you that this guy would have been beaten up. Nawaz Sharif's time, the previous prime minister, he had journalists beaten up. Asif Zardari, people were petrified of him. People would disappear. In my time, I went to the legal channels, I reported it to the media, I went into the court. All I'm saying is that what the media in Pakistan is, you will not find a media like that. And I remember the previous ambassador to Pakistan, him saying that the media was out of control. So what we need is to control the media, and not through the government, but through a media watchdog. At the moment, I mean, there are 2 or 3 things the media did. One is that they started reporting wrongly that the IMF had said that the rupee would fall, to a number they quoted. There was a run on the rupee. I mean, who would do that? First, you're fighting in the biggest economic crisis in your history. Second, you have media coming up with this false news about causing a run on the rupee, or the finance minister's change, and so on. So I feel very strongly that we will strengthen the media watchdog. It is not censorship. We will strengthen the media watchdog. But there are 70 channels or 80 channels in Pakistan. Now, there was a court case in the end, and in the court he was convicted. But do you know there was a media channel, one of the most powerful media channels, they did everything to protect him. Now, this is not what a media is supposed to do. The media did everything. They covered up for him, not just protecting him. I, who was asking my democratic right, a question to asking someone, where did you get the money? I was attacked, personal attacks. I mean, the sort of attacks I faced, no political leader I challenged, no political leader would have gone through the sort of personal attacks they went, because they couldn't attack me on my on integrity, so they went on these personal attacks. So this is not normal for media to do this. Media is not supposed to do this. Media is supposed to be a watchdog, to bring out, play the role of an opposition. But they're not about personal attacks and trying to blackmail you. We just had another case right now. There's a judge who convicted the previous prime minister. Now this judge, the opposition brought out a video blackmailing him about him with some compromising video with some woman. They brought this up. This happens in Italian mafias. It doesn't happen in democracies. So I mean, sometimes, I firmly believe that eventually we will have to move where the media owners will have to disclose their source of income. Just like anyone else, they'll have to say, how much tax do they pay? What is the source of income? Even if you ask them how much tax you paid, some of these media say this is it's against freedom of expression.
So looking at it from that perspective versus a censorship regime, but more of a transparency effort is the focus.
And Nancy, accountable media. Media should also be accountable. You can't have a media sort of protecting criminals in a society.
Okay, we're going to move the conversation. Here, there are a number of questions about Afghanistan. I think you've covered that. But here's one specifically asking, how do you view the peace talks about Afghanistan hosted by both Russia and Uzbekistan?
We should really get all the neighbors of Afghanistan involved with the peace talks, because it should be the interest. Pakistan, the United States, and Afghanistan. These 3 countries today are the most interested in having peace in Afghanistan. But not all neighbors are interested in peace in Afghanistan. Because, for various reasons, other countries have their own agendas. So I firmly believe that the US should try and co-opt as many countries as possible. Because there will be people who will be trying to put a spanner in the works. And so if the neighbors are all involved, there's a much better chance of the talks going smoothly.
And speaking of neighbors, there's a question saying and you mentioned this in your opening remarks, what role can Pakistan play in easing the rising tensions with Iran and a number of other countries, including the United States, without damaging some of your other relationships? How are you thinking about that?
You see, Pakistan is, we're really indebted to Saudi Arabia, we're indebted to UAE, because the way they came forward, when we were confronted with this, when we took over government, we only had 2 weeks of foreign exchange reserves. So we were staring at a default, and these countries came forward to help us, and so we are really indebted to them. But my worry about Iran is, I'm not sure whether all the countries realize the gravity of the situation if there's a conflict with Iran. People don't understand, this is not going to be the same as Iraq. This could be much, much, much worse. It will have great consequences for Pakistan, adverse consequences for our country. It could unleash terrorism, which people would forget Al-Qaeda and those types, because the Iranian, the Shia element in Islam is very cohesive. They have a much greater sense of martyrdom than the Sunni Muslims. The battle might be quite short if it goes ahead and bombing airfields and so on. But the consequences after that, my worry is that not many people fully understand it, and I would strongly urge that there should not be this conflict there should not be another military situation. Pakistan has already suffered. I said, what we went through these last 15 years, the last thing we want is another conflict on our borders. And, we would do anything. I mean, if any role Pakistan can play in this, we have already suggested this to Iran. Until recently, Iran was willing, but then when somehow I felt that Iran is getting very desperate, and I do not think they should be pushed into a situation where this leads to a conflict.
Another question via Twitter. What are some of the concrete steps your government is taking to ensure that the military operates under civilian leadership? Something you alluded to in your earlier comments.
You see, in Pakistan, we had 3 martial laws, and the last one was General Musharraf's. I think General Musharraf's martial law was a watershed in Pakistan, in the sense that there was a opinion across the board that when you have bad democracy, the answer is not to have a military government. Because the military government comes in, it's like curing cancer with disprin. For a while you feel good because they are organized, it's an organized institution. But eventually, you end up in even a worse situation, because then democracy starts all over again. And what we need in Pakistan now is an extended run of democracy. And I really do believe that the democratic evolution of the country has reached a point where now we will go towards further democracy. I mean, us winning the election is who would have thought we would have won an election against these? How many times in a 2-party system has a third party broken through? It's unheard of. I mean, nowhere in the world does a third party break through. We broke through because of social media. We actually, despite the official media sort of not giving us that sort of coverage, all the opinion polls were that we would not make it. But it was the social media and the young people who came out and and made us defeat the two established parties. And I think the process will keep going on. I think that in Pakistan, people have tasted freedom. They understand, the power of the vote. In fact, social media has actually democratized the whole world. Everyone now has, they have Twitter, everyone can participate.
That's how we're getting questions. Yeah. Well, I have two related questions on that I think build on the vision that you just articulated. And the first is, what will the government do to address closing space for civil society? And how does that fit into your vision? And closing space for civil society and activists.
I don't understand. How is the government?
Well, I think
You're closing space for civil society?
There's another question about Gulale Ismail and other activists.
You're talking about PTM. PTM. Yeah, that's PTM.
It's called civil. I think they're saying it's a broader civil society question, but
it's actually related to PTM. Look, all these years I kept saying, when Pakistan, I stood up in the National Assembly in our parliament in 2004. I objected to the Pakistan army being sent into our tribal areas. No one understood the tribal areas. The only reason I understood the tribal areas is because some 30 years back, I wrote a book on the tribal areas. I did a travel book. I went all over, and so I understood the tribal areas. As I said, it is one of the most weaponized per capita area in the world. It's a most devolved democracy. Every village is an independent entity, and so they have never allowed outside interference to come into the tribal areas. So when Pakistan Army was being sent there in 2004, I stood in the parliament, tried to explain to them that the greatest number of losses when the British were ruling India, they suffered the greatest number of losses in Waziristan, which is tribal area. So we should never have sent army there. Whenever you send an army into civilian areas, there are massive collateral damage and massive casualties and destruction. So all the time when I was speaking out against this, I was being called Taliban Khan. I was being called pro-terrorist. General Musharraf, I remember, in a meeting said that I am a terrorist without a beard. And so once this whole thing was over, this young Pashtun movement started. And this Pashtun movement was correct, what they were saying. The area was devastated. The people of the tribal areas, I mean, half of them were internally displaced. Their shops were gone. Most of them relied on livestock. Livestock disappeared. The whole area was, as it is, tribal areas before 2001, 75% of the people were under the poverty line. So after this military action, they even went further down. So we had this young movement and movement stemming out of anger. And of course, they blamed the Pakistan army for all the devastation there. And we've just had elections in the tribal area now. We've just had, first time in Pakistan's history, the tribal area has been assimilated with Pakhtunkhwa, a province. And first time we've had election, and I'm very pleased to say that PTI won the election. But we have now injected the greatest amount of money in the tribal areas to develop it. Never has so much money been allocated for development there. But the reason why there were problems was that the PTM leadership started attacking the army. And they kept attacking the army, and the last thing happened was that civilians charged an army post, there were few people killed, and that's why there were restrictions. But now it's settling down because we've had peaceful elections in the tribal areas. So I think we will now move on.
Yeah, I think the question was probably triggered a bit by the New York Times article about the harassments and arrests of this Gulale Ismail family friends.
I wish that they would, the New York Times would also take the other point of view. Now I'm sounding like President Trump.
So we have time for just a couple more questions. The U.S. has been asking Pakistan to do more in the context of terrorism. It relates a little bit to what you were saying. They particularly were asking Pakistan to do more in the context of GEM. And after the arrest of Hafiz Saeed, is this it? Will he stay in custody this time, or will he be allowed to go off again?
Now, you ask, first, we want an independent justice system, and you want me to predict what the justice system would do. Now, look, let me just say, I repeat one thing again. It is in the interest of Pakistan that we do not allow any armed militias in our country. We have suffered. The country has suffered sectarian attacks. We have had the worst situation. It has affected our investment. Pakistan has not, it has destabilized us. This whole thing, Pulwama, what happened in February last year, it was clearly an indigenous thing. It was a Kashmiri boy radicalized by the brutality of the security forces. He blew himself up. But because this group claimed responsibility, which was in India as well, Jaish-e-Mohammed was operating in India, but Pakistan suddenly came in the limelight. So even before this had happened, we had already decided that we would disarm all militant groups in Pakistan. And it is in Pakistan's interest, I repeat, it's in our interest, because the country has had enough of militant groups. You know, we had ethnic groups, militant groups. We had, in Balochistan, we still have militant groups operating. Then we had these various religious groups. So there is a decision now, and by the way, it is across the party. Every political party has signed the National Action Plan. Pakistan is now determined, and you know, normally it was said that the security forces patronize the groups. The security forces, we would not be disarming them if the security forces were not standing behind us. You cannot disarm because the police is incapable of disarming these groups. They are trained. I mean, they have, these people have experience of fighting in Afghanistan, some in Kashmir. The police cannot go after them. So it's the army that is helping us disarm all militant groups in our country.
Mr. Prime Minister, you have been very generous with your time. We have so many more questions that we won't be able to get to. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. But before we close, I want to ask one last question, which is, this is your first visit here as Prime Minister. We have a very distinguished audience here of policymakers, people in and out of government, people who care deeply about the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. What final message would you like to leave as a closing thought for everyone?
I would like to, my message from my trip, first trip as the Prime Minister to the U.S., I would like to have a relationship between the two countries of mutual trust. I would like to have a relationship as equals of friendship, not as it has been before, where Pakistan has sort of been, you know, it's like Pakistan wanting aid from the US, and then as for aid, Pakistan is expected to do certain things. The reason why I'm happy leaving the US this time, because we have a relationship now based on a mutual interest, which is peace in Afghanistan. And, you know, someone asked that, will you get this funds? I hate the idea that we would be asking for funds, not US, from anyone. Because aid has been one of the biggest curses for my country. What it has done is, it has created the dependency syndrome. We have become, you know, when I went on my first trip to Saudi Arabia, I came back. What have you got from there? As if I'd gone there to beg for money. And I think it's humiliating for a country. Countries rise because of self-respect and self-esteem. No countries rise by begging and borrowing for money. So my relationship with the US would be, I would like a relationship with, a dignified relationship with the US, where never again should we ever have that humiliating phase. I can tell you as a Pakistani, never did I feel more humiliated when Osama bin Laden was taken out in Pakistan by the US troops. Never did I feel more humiliated, because here was a country which was supposed to be an ally, and our ally did not trust us. So as a Pakistani, it was, for every Pakistani, it was humiliating. We never want to be in that same position again. We want to have a relationship of friendship. And it doesn't matter, friend can be rich and the other can not be so rich. But so what? It's about a dignified relationship, and that's what I hope to have with the US.
I'd like to present you with a small token of our appreciation for your visit here.
Thank you, Nancy.
Invite you to come back and wish you all the best.